Hey, everybody, welcome and thank you for joining. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We're going to wait maybe a couple more minutes, let folks show up, and then we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Hi.
Hi, Buzz.
Can you see me?
Yes. Can you see me?
I can't see me.
Oh.
That's okay. That's better that way. Hey, Mark.
Howdy. How are you?
Good. How about yourself?
I'm doing good too.
Good.
Okay. We'll wait about another minute or two, and then we'll get started. And feel free if you'd like, introduce yourself in the chat.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi.
Okay. Welcome to the SJCA August Scoop. Today, Mark, our Executive Director, will be presenting. Mark's been with the organization in some capacity since 1993, first starting as a volunteer, then an ED for 10 years, onto a board member, and now back as our Executive Director. Mark has been, he's well versed in all of our programs, but today he'll be talking about the Colorado Wilderness Act and the CORE Act, which I know is near and dear to his heart, and you as well, since you're here. And with that, I'll let Mark take it away.
Great, thank you, Susan. Appreciate the chance to talk about our wild landscapes here in the San Juan Mountains and in Southwest Colorado. So that's what we'll be covering today, kind of the history of wilderness, how we got to where we are so far, and then kind of what the opportunities are that are pending right now, and give you an update on where things are in terms of Congress acting on a couple of these wilderness bills. So as you know, what motivates people to get involved in trying to protect the wild places here in their backyards is personal engagement and being immersed in those wild places and then feeling the need to take action to try to make sure that they are preserved in that condition for future generations to enjoy in a similar fashion. And here in the San Juans, we know, that people have been out doing the kinds of activities we do today for, at least the last 100 years. And the Colorado Mountain Club in the early 19 teens and 20s used to do these annual outings, and they'd pick a place in Colorado and go and spend most of a month in the mountains there. And in 1920, Chicago Basin, which is now in the Weminuche Wilderness, was the site of one of their annual August outings. And this is part of the crew that climbed one of the peaks one of the days. But it's just a great reminder that those are the kinds of people and experiences which are what lead to our ability to mobilize people to get engaged and get their elected officials to take action to protect these kind of places. So this is the landscape of protected wilderness areas across Colorado. The dark green are the wilderness areas, and hopefully people can, even if you're colorblind, hopefully you can see the darkest patches, but those are existing wilderness areas. And one of the reasons we focus on wilderness is that it's the highest level of protection that we have in the United States in terms of guaranteeing that places will be left undeveloped and unmodified for as long as we can hope. And this is what we've got across the state of Colorado right now. The Wilderness Act was passed originally in 1964, and it has some very flowery and inspiring language that is the introduction to it. And one of the motivations was by the proponents of creating the idea of protected wilderness areas, which actually really started back in about 1920 with Aldo Leopold, was this response to the idea that so much of our landscape was being modified by settlement and mechanization and development. And so the Wilderness Act starts off and says, in order to assure that an increasing population accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization does not occupy and modify all areas within the United States. And so that's the premise, is that looking at how much of our landscape by middle of last century had been converted into homes and highways and towns and farms and ranches and clear cuts and mines and all that kind of change of the natural environment, that there needed to be some bulwark against that continuing everywhere across our landscape. So that was the motivation behind the Wilderness Act. And it described wilderness as being areas of undeveloped federal land retaining its primeval character and influence without permanent improvement or human habitation. So again, it was the parts of the landscape that weren't turned into towns and farms and ranches and all those kinds of other kind of industrial activities as well. And so what does it mean to be able to be designated as a wilderness area? What are the criteria that were laid out whereby we could identify and designate lands as wilderness under the terms of the Wilderness Act? Well, as it first describes, that it has to be an area that's affected primarily by the forces of nature, where the imprint of human activity is substantially unnoticeable. And so notice one thing there, that the word pristine never shows up in the Wilderness Act. And even though we like to tend to, use flowery language like, these are such pristine places, they're not, it was never intended that they would be completely untouched by any human activity in any prior generation. It was that compared to the rest of the landscape, these are the places that really haven't had much modification or development on them. So the places where human activity is substantially unnoticeable is the criteria, and it allows for, maybe there's been an old wagon road or some remnant mining exploration or some things like that occurred, or perhaps a little bit of tree cutting. But if you looked at the overall bigger picture, the amount of human activity would be substantially unnoticeable. Then also is identified as places that have outstanding opportunities and or primitive and unconfined types of recreation. So that's sort of the human challenge aspect, you might say, of these wild landscapes. So places you can get away from lots of people or escape the pressures and sights and sounds of civilization and find solitude and challenge yourself in primitive types of recreation. There's a size criteria. It needs to be at least 5,000 acres or greater. And then it certainly helps if there's some special ecological, geological, or other kinds of scientific values present as well. And then once a wilderness area is designated, and remember, wilderness areas can only be established by an act of Congress. So federal agencies like the Forest Service can make a recommendation on what they think should be wilderness, but only Congress can actually establish a wilderness area. And the allowed uses are those kinds of primitive recreation that was mentioned as one of the qualities of wilderness, which is stuff like hiking and backpacking and horsepacking and floating, etc. Hunting and fishing is still permitted. It's not affected at all by a wilderness designation. And livestock grazing also can continue to exist, be an ongoing activity as long as it existed prior to the wilderness designation. But the things that are not allowed are the things that would change the wilderness character. So you can't have new road construction or mining or oil and gas leasing or logging or timber harvest, and can't use motorized or mechanized equipment, and you can't have new water storage and diversion projects. So basically the things that would change the character of the wilderness qualities there are the kinds of things that are prohibited. So in Colorado, we have 44 wilderness areas designated in Colorado since 1964. It's about 3.7 million acres in total. That's about 5.5% of Colorado's land base. Our whole state, our big square, is 66.5 million acres. So the amount of wilderness designated is about 5.5%. It's about 15% of the federal lands in Colorado. And again, remember, wilderness can only be designated on federal lands. So those managed by the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service. And the Weminuche Wilderness here in our backyard is the largest wilderness area in Colorado, which is 500,000 acres. So it's far and away it's twice the size of the next largest wilderness anywhere in Colorado. And then there's a bunch of additional proposed new wilderness areas that citizens across the state and citizen groups have proposed in various combinations. And all of those put together would maybe amount to about another 4 million acres if those were ever to come to fruition. So at the most, we're looking at potentially maybe doubling the amount of wilderness designated in the state, but that's probably unlikely since it's atypical for all of these areas to become designated by Congress, even though they've been proposed by somebody somewhere. So at the most, we might be looking at maybe 10% of the state's land base could potentially ever be designated in the wilderness system. So in 1964, there were 5 areas originally designated in Colorado. The closest one to us was the La Garita Wilderness outside of Creed. And one of the things the Wilderness Act did is it told the federal agencies to go forward and conduct investigations and make recommendations on what additional areas should be added to the wilderness system. And so throughout the 1960s and 70s, the Forest Service evaluated its land base, and the National Park Service did also. And in 1976, the Bureau of Land Management was added into the mix, and they were told to similarly go out and find the qualifying areas within their land base and make recommendations to Congress about those. And over the intervening 50 some years now, this is the wilderness system that exists today in Colorado. The green are the national forest areas. That's the overwhelming majority of the wilderness in Colorado. 36 of the 44 areas are national forests. There's 4 national parks that have wilderness within their boundaries, the biggest being Rocky Mountain National Park outside of Boulder and Fort Collins. And then there's only 5 areas managed by the Bureau of Land Management that are within the wilderness system too. So it's there's very little of our lower elevation and desert and mesa landscapes. And the BLM, you might recall, is primarily an agency that manages our arid plateaus and canyons and our lower elevation areas across the western slope. All right, so here's another, here's the map again of all the existing wilderness areas in dark green. So if you were to think about what are the additional opportunities that are out there, well, remember that it has to be places that are where human activity and development is substantially unnoticeable. So that immediately turns your attention to the roadless areas in our state that are under federal ownership or federal management. And so here are the lime green on this map. These are all the roadless areas across Colorado that are managed by the Forest Service. The Colorado roadless areas is how they're termed by the Forest Service. And it's about 4 million acres altogether. It's about equivalent land base to what we already have designated as wilderness. So this would be, this is sort of the list of candidates, you might say, that are out there. But of course, a number of these have other uses that are ongoing in them that don't mesh with wilderness. So they might have snowmobiling or motorized or bicycling use or other things that might pose a pretty substantial social conflict with getting them designated as wilderness. So there's no way all these areas could ever get added into the wilderness system really, but there are some kind of obvious high profile candidates. And then similarly, if you move over to the BLM landscapes, remember back in 1976, the BLM went forward and had to identify the candidates that it found for potential addition to the wilderness system. That's these sort of burnt orange, dark orange blobs on the map. Those were all identified by the BLM back in 1980 as official wilderness study areas. So those were the areas that the BLM found to have the highest qualities as potential additions to the wilderness system. So that's sort of the universe of opportunity, you might say, that exists for adding to the wilderness system in Colorado. And then if we kind of zoom in on just the southwest corner of Colorado, you can see that same map. The big green blob here in the middle is the Weminuche Wilderness, and to the west of that is the Lizard Head Wilderness. And one of the blobs you can see between there, one of the lime green blobs, that's a roadless area, is variously called either the San Miguel roadless area or the Sheep Mountain roadless area. So it's one of the, it's an obvious candidate for addition, because one of the things we like to pursue within the context of a more completed wilderness system is to make sure that wilderness areas are interconnected, and that particularly if you think about the benefit of species who need the sort of isolation and solitude that wilderness brings, by having connected wilderness areas, it allows species to move more easily, between those protected landscapes. And so a place like the San Miguel roadless area or Sheep Mountain, or probably more folks might know of it as Ice Lake Basin, that big chunk of country fills the gap you can see between the Weminuche Wilderness to the east and the Lizard Head Wilderness to the west. So we at San Juan Citizens Alliance, when we look at the landscape here across the San Juan Mountains, and we think about, what would be appropriate to add to the wilderness system to kind of complete the map, a place like the San Miguel or Ice Lake Basin or Sheep Mountain is the place that jumps out and says, boy, we should really be advocating for some kind of permanent protection for that. And that's what we started doing about 15 years ago with the CORE Act. And it originally was not called the CORE Act. It was originally called the San Juan Mountains Wilderness Act. So in 2009, this came together as a proposed package of additional protections for the San Juan Mountains. Just the way that, for example, we here in San Juan Citizens Alliance were zeroed in on trying to protect Ice Lake Basin and that country around Sheep Mountain. our kind of allied groups in Telluride and Ridgeway were doing the same thing and looking at the maps in their backyards and recognize that, for example, the rest of the Sneffels Range should be added into the wilderness system as well, because only half of the Sneffels Range is actually in the Mount Sneffels Wilderness Area. So they came up with that proposal separately, and so those all were put together, and that's what came to be the San Juan Mountains Wilderness Act, which was introduced in 2009. And it's a total of 60,000 acres across 5 different kinds of units in the San Juan Mountains. And then later, after we were pursuing the San Juan Mountains Wilderness Act here, there were folks up in Breckenridge and Vail and Eagle County and Summit County who were proposing some wilderness additions up there. And then there was a group of folks in Carbondale and in that area trying to get the Thompson Divide, which is the lands west of McClure Pass, protected from oil and gas development. So they had a proposal called the Thompson Divide special area. And all these things are percolating separately. So they were all eventually combined into one piece of legislation that's called the CORE Act, which is the Colorado Outdoor Recreation and Economy Act, or CORE for short. And so that's actually 4 different chunks of Colorado all combined into one piece. But the thing we've always focused on down here, obviously, is the San Juan Mountains part of that. So you can go to our website. We have a section of our website that is called the San Juan Mountains Wilderness Act still. We haven't ever really changed that to CORE Act. But so our San Juan Mountains Wilderness piece are these 5 parts that are being proposed for addition or protections. One is the Mount Sneffels Wilderness Expansion that would double the size of Mount Sneffels. There'd be some small additions to the Lizard Head Wilderness. Sheep Mountain would get some protection, but not as an official wilderness area for a couple of reasons I'll mention in a minute here. And then a couple other different kinds of designations. One is to put Natarita Canyon off limits to future oil and gas leasing because of its watershed values. And in addition, McKenna Peak would achieve wilderness designation as the first BLM wilderness here in the Southwest Colorado as well. So that's the 5 parts of what's in the San Juan Mountains Wilderness Act. And if you go to the website, you can see maps and descriptions of each of these pieces. So this is the classic view of the Sneffels Range from Dallas Divide, outside of Ridgeway. Now Sneffels is the pyramid peak in the middle, but most of Mount Sneffels is not actually in the Mount Sneffels wilderness area. The wilderness boundary is literally right on the top of the summit of the peak, and it only includes the southwest flank of Mount Sneffels. And then the range to the west of the peak is what's the actual Mount Sneffels wilderness. But the other 75% of Mount Sneffels itself and the rest of the Sneffels Range to the east, so like Potosi Peak and White House Mountain and Ridgeway, those other peaks, none of those are actually in the wilderness. So the idea was, let's complete the protection for the entirety of the Sneffels Range. And that's probably one of the main features of the San Juan Mountains part of the CORE Act is finishing the protection of Mount Sneffels. And if you look at Sneffels, that north face, that's called Blaine Basin. And there's a great little trail that goes up into Blaine Basin. And so this is kind of the heart of what would be added to the Mount Sneffels Wilderness, the north face of the peak. That's the, so heavily photographed area. And then this wonderful alpine basin would be added into the CORE Act. And this is a trip we did a couple of years ago with a bunch of business supporters of the CORE Act and San Juan Mountains Wilderness Protection that are organized under the Conservation Alliance. And so they've been big supporters of protecting it. And we did a little field trip to show some of the folks what we were talking about. Then one of the other key places everyone, literally everyone has been to is Ice Lake. It's a spectacular alpine watershed. Unfortunately, it's been discovered on Instagram a bit, but still a dramatic and spectacular place. But some of the less visited parts of the area are actually the top of Sheep Mountain, like right here. And this is the big backdrop peaks behind Trout Lake on top of Lizard Head Pass. So this is kind of the heart of the Sheep Mountain Special Management Area. We would have loved to have seen it be designated wilderness, but here's the map of what Sheep Mountain, the boundary of the designation, and it kind of highlights what some of the conflicts are maybe with wilderness. And it also shows that there's a lot of thought and attention put into, putting on a map precisely where, the best boundaries should be. So, boundaries either follow roads like this road up the South Fork of Mineral Creek, or, drawn to make sure to exclude private property or subdivisions. But even with that, there's still a lot of private land in the terms of patented mining claims. All these little rectangular pieces across Ice Lake Basin are private property patented mining claims. So those could be used by the private owners in some fashion that might not be compatible with wilderness. So it's one reason we couldn't designate all of this as wilderness. Another reason is Hope Lake is actually a reservoir, and it's owned by Xcel Energy. So if they ever needed to come and rebuild the dam there, that could cause some conflicts with the Wilderness Act, and it's part of the Trout Lake and Ames hydropower project. So, and the other thing is that there's a Helitrax, Telluride Helitrax has a heliskiing permit for flying people into heliski in the area here, and heliskiing helicopter landings are not allowed in wilderness for that kind of recreational activity. So for all those reasons, it's got a different designation. Rather than calling it a wilderness area, it's going to be a special management area, and it's still off limits to mining and oil and gas development and logging. That there's a lot of trees there, but road building and that kind of thing. So it'll be sort of like wilderness, but not entirely. But you can see maps like this for all the areas in the Core Act or the San Juan Mountains piece at our website. Well, then the other part of what's available for a wilderness opportunity are the BLM lands in Southwest Colorado, and that's these orange, primarily these dark orange wilderness study areas. And those are one of the things that we at San Juan Citizens Alliance have been focused on for 20 plus years also, to look for opportunities to try to move permanent protection for those. And those are part of the now included in what we're talking about as the Colorado Wilderness Act. And it's a statewide bill that's focused on the BLM lands. You might think of the Colorado Wilderness Act as the desert wilderness bill for Colorado, and the Core Act is kind of more the mountain wilderness bill for Colorado. The Core Act is pretty much all national forest lands, and the Colorado Wilderness Act is pretty much entirely BLM lands. And so for Southwest Colorado here, there's about 230,000 acres and about a dozen areas that are in the Colorado Wilderness Act. And statewide, it's about 660,000 acres and about 3 dozen areas, 36 areas or so. And there's a website also that describes all of these areas, the coloradowildernissact.org. So it's a good place to go find out more information, see the maps, see brief descriptions of each of the areas. But here so this is the map of the Colorado Wilderness Act statewide. And again, the dark green are the existing wilderness areas, and all the orange are all the variety of new BLM wilderness designations. And so you can see here in Southwest Colorado, we've got, a fair number down here. And the background of these again is the BLM in 1980 identified these wilderness study areas that totaled about 800,000 acres. And then in 1994, the citizen groups in Colorado put together our proposal for what we thought should be designated as wilderness, and that was a bit larger at 1.2 million acres. And then in 1999 is the first time that proposal was introduced as legislation. It was called the Colorado Wilderness Act back in 1999, and it was introduced by Representative Diana DeGette. And every Congress since 1999, she's been championing the Colorado Wilderness Act, trying to get it through Congress and over the finish line. And today, in 2021, the Colorado Wilderness Act consists of this 660,000 acres and 36 units. And most of those are these wilderness study areas that were first identified back in 1980. And here it's kind of zoomed in on Southwest Colorado. You can see the landscapes we're talking about, places over in Canyons of the Ancients like Cross Canyon and Papoose Canyon, a bunch of areas along the Dolores River Canyon, like the Ponderosa Gorge, the Dolores River Canyon near Bedrock, Willamette Mesa, the Palisade, which are other places closer nearer to Gateway. And then one of the oddball things with the BLM, always we like to say they're the desert agency, but then they manage 3 of our 14,000 foot peaks between Silverton and Lake City. So there's a couple of proposed wilderness areas up there as well. And this is Representative DeGette here in the blue. She loves to go out and visit the areas. This is a trip she did 2 years ago to Cross Canyon out on the state line west of Cortez, and she likes to go on horseback tours. So she and her staff had a good morning out visiting Cross Canyon and finding petroglyphs, and it's a great way for her to feel like she's got a lot of on the ground familiarity with what's in the bill. So Cross Canyon is one of the longest wild undeveloped canyons in the whole state of Colorado. It's probably 20 miles from the top to the bottom, just a beautifully undeveloped, remote, long canyon right on the state line pretty much. And you can see Sleeping Ute in the background of this photograph, but it's really a wonderful and wild part of our state that gets very little use and is not very well known, and full of a lot of Puebloan artifacts as well. As I said, there's a number of areas in the Colorado Wilderness Act that are part of the Dolores River Canyon ecosystem, I guess you'd say. One of those is the Dolores River between Gypsum Valley and Bedrock. It's kind of the classic slick rock canyon country of the Dolores, and certainly every bit as grand as any of the famous sandstone canyons in Colorado Plateau and Utah. And one of the prime ways to use it is to float through it on the kind of less and less frequent opportunities we have to float the Dolores. But it certainly is one of the most sublime wilderness river experiences in the West, without a doubt. McKenna Peak, as I mentioned, is also actually in the Core Act, but it's in the Colorado Wilderness Act as well. It's some of the adobe badlands that are in Disappointment Valley. So Disappointment Valley is, again, one of the more remote and unvisited parts of our state, which is east of the little post office of Slick Rock, or I guess it's not a post office anymore, but about 50 miles east of Slick Rock. And then Willamette Mesa is one of the units on the Dolores River Canyon closer to Gateway. It's a collapsed salt dome, forms this tremendous cliff face on the west slope of Willamette Mesa. It's one of the more inaccessible parts of the Colorado Plateau, and it's actually a place where the word pristine might really apply, in that it's never been grazed on top. So it has some of the most extraordinary biological soil crust that you'll find in our part of the world. And then farther north, just outside of Gateway, is the Palisade, another spectacular section of the dramatic Wingate sandstone cliffs that define the Dolores River Canyon country, and with the La Salle Mountains in Utah just behind them. And then the couple of 14ers up above Lake City and Silverton. Handy's Peak is one of the wilderness study areas up there that's in the wilderness bill, and the other being Red Cloud Peak just across the road from it. And so those two areas together are about 75,000 acres of classic high country Colorado wilderness that would also be designated as part of the Colorado Wilderness Act. So where are we in Congress? So both the Colorado Wilderness Act and the Core Act have passed the House of Representatives this year in February. And as you probably know, to make a bill into a law, you have to pass through both the House and the Senate. So we're halfway there, having gotten through the House of Representatives. The House combined the Colorado Wilderness Act and the Core Act, along with about half a dozen or more other big lands bills for California and Washington and Arizona, and they called it all together the Protecting America's Wilderness Act, or the PAW Act. So rather than try to pass all these bills one at a time, they're all put into one big package, and that's the PAW Act. So that's what has passed the House of Representatives. The Senate is moving a lot more slowly, but in June they did have a hearing on the Core Act and some other lands bills. So they're starting to take the first slow steps towards moving along on the Senate side. And so, likely what will happen if these bills do finally get across the finish line this session of Congress, which runs until the end of next year, 2022, it'll probably end up being a mix of some of the bills that are in the Senate and some of the bills that are in the House, and they'll package these all together into one big thing that might have dozens of different features to it. And it'd be, we call those an omnibus lands package, but not only will it include some of the big Western bills, but there could be bills for national seashores in Massachusetts and wilderness bills in Virginia and things like that. So that's probably what we're waiting to see, if that would be the path forward. Most of these lands bills have been proposed by Democrats, so you need to get some Republican proposals to put together a package that has enough support from both Republicans and Democrats that it can move through the Senate in particular. And it's not clear yet that there's going to be enough Republican proposals that are palatable to the Democrats that it might be able to move forward this session, but that's what people are hoping for. The other possibility is that you could still put these lands bills into kind of an unrelated piece of legislation in Congress. And last year, there was an attempt to get them added to the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the funding bill for the Defense Department every year that everybody supports, basically, or nobody wants to. It's a so-called must-pass piece of legislation. So if you can get things added onto it, it's a way to enact your legislation if you can't move it in a standalone fashion. So that's one of the other options that people are contemplating. So that's that's kind of my little whirlwind tour of what's pending and what the opportunities are. And again, to remember what the Wilderness Act talked about, which is the point of wilderness and wilderness designation, is to secure for the American people of present and future generations the benefits of an enduring resource of wilderness. And while we've made some pretty good progress in previous decades in Colorado, in the last 20 years, there's only been 2 new areas added to the wilderness system in Colorado. Hermosa being the most recent, just outside our front door or back door here in Durango, was added in 2014. And then prior to that was Dominguez Canyon up near Grand Junction was added in 2009. But other than those 2 areas, there's been no new wilderness designations in Colorado for 20 years. So that's why we're, knock on wood, hoping that both the Core Act and the Colorado Wilderness Act can get over the finish line this year, and we kind of break that drought of wilderness protection. So with that, we'll open it up, and happy to answer any questions or hear any comments folks have. And Susan, I don't know if you have to do anything to make that happen, or if it's just open to anybody who wants to weigh in and ask any questions.
Sure. Yes, you can ask a question in the chat, raise your hand, unmute yourself. It's a pretty informal discussion. And I'm going to unshare your screen.
Okay.
If I might ask you to do that, Mark.
There you go.
So we can see everybody.
Questions, comments?
Mark, this is Buzz Bricka.
Hi, Buzz.
What would you say is the most effective way of communicating with Senators Bennett and Hickenlooper? Would that be an email or text or voicemail, or is there any modality that's more likely to get there than another?
You know, that's a good question, and it might be, I thought I saw Tara was on the call here maybe earlier. She might know better than anybody, having worked for a senator. But, you know, one thing I've always heard is to work through the local staff. So both Senator Bennett and Hickenlooper have staffers here in Durango, John Whitney for Senator Bennett and
Sure.
Ellen Kadich for Senator Hickenlooper. And so they're probably more likely to pay attention to getting a input from a local constituent, and then they can funnel that up to the Washington office rather than just trying to email the Washington office, and it kind of gets lost in the mix of all the other constituent input. So I would, you know, if you have an opportunity to meet either of those staffers at anything, talk to them directly, or I would, you know, shoot them an email or leave them a voicemail would be a great opportunity as well, I think.
Okay, thanks.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is from Janet Wyatt. What's the best way to support these efforts?
Yeah, well, I think contacting the two senators is probably the key. You know, it'd be great if our Congresswoman Lauren Boebert would support them, but I don't think she's likely to. So, but in particular, just showing your support to the senators, I think would be particularly valuable, and in specific, when it comes to the Colorado Wilderness Act, neither Senator Hickenlooper or Senator Bennett have weighed in yet in support of the Colorado Wilderness Act. One of the reasons is that they are, you know, usually quite concerned about what local elected officials and particularly county commissioners think about federal lands legislation. And you know, most of these BLM lands are in parts of our state where the county commissioners are not likely to probably be supportive of lands protection and federal lands bills like this. So the more that they hear from just regular constituents in Western Colorado, the more, you know, the more weight that I think that'll carry. So I think that'd probably be the most important thing you could do.
And Janet, there's also a link that Raina had dropped into the chat. We also will send out action alerts if there is specific actions that you can take, whether it be public comment, calling our senators or representatives on certain issues. So thank you for that question. The next one was from Julie Beer, and it's not a dumb question, but she said, are there still any Republicans that support wilderness? Do they have to go through Senator McConnell?
So on the House side, when the bill passed the House, there were actually eight Republican votes in favor of it. That was only 8 out of 200, but was still 8. And there tend to be kind of more Midwestern and Eastern Republicans. There was Representative Upton from Michigan, and then a couple from Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and I think a member from Florida. So there's still a number, a few Republicans on the House side who supported the wilderness bills. And on the Senate side, you know, I think it's kind of less and less than there used to be, but you know, there might still be some opportunities for actually even somebody like Senator Romney from Utah, I think might be willing to support some of these things. So yeah, it's still a tough go though. And it has gotten to be so, you know, like many other societal debates, it's gotten to be pretty locked into partisanship, unfortunately. Whereas, you know, some of the greatest champions we had for our wilderness system in Colorado were our Republican senators, like Peter Dominic, who was a senator in the 1960s and 70s, was one of the real champions of wilderness in Colorado, and he was one of the biggest supporters of wild and scenic rivers as well. And in fact, the only wild and scenic river we have in the state is named the Peter H. Dominic Wild River segment through the Cache la Poudre Wilderness because of his support. So it would be nice to be able to recapture that sort of sense of bipartisanship, but unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be where we are these days.
And then Jerish Willis just wanted to know, why is the summit in the southwest slopes of Sheep Mountain not included?
So that's a very astute question. Good for looking at the map. You'll notice that happens to also be the county line. And so the core act, for better or worse, is sort of defined by county boundaries. And it kind of gets back to, Senator Bennett's approach of wanting to have county commissioner support to include anything in the in a lands bill. So in the core act, it only includes lands from counties where the county commissioners are supportive of that designation. And Dolores County, which is the southwest slopes of Sheep Mountain, didn't want any protective designation overlaid on that part of Sheep Mountain that was within the bounds of their county. So there's nothing in Dolores County that's included in the core act. So that's why that boundary is drawn that way. And it doesn't make any sense ecologically. And it's unfortunate that we would defer to what county commissioners think about our national federal public lands, but that's been the approach that's been pursued.
Oh, we got a question from Jennifer.
Along that same line, Montezuma County kind of follows Dolores County. And I was wondering if there's anything on the core act that, or on the Colorado Wilderness Bill that is included in Montezuma County that we might need to work on with the county commissioners.
Well,
or try to work on.
Yeah, there's a good question. There's a bunch of, so all those lands in like Cross Canyon that we talked about is Montezuma County and Dolores County. And the big difference there is that Congresswoman DeGette, who's from Denver, views wilderness as something of statewide concern. And these are national lands that belong to everybody. And so while she's welcomes county commissioner input, she doesn't defer to that. And so she was out here a couple of years ago. She went and visited Cross Canyon. She went on had a visit with all the county commissioners. They were all quite insistent that nothing in Montezuma County should ever be designated as wilderness. And she said, thanks for your input. But it didn't, she's not going to change her bill because the county commissioners don't want any wilderness in the county. So I think, probably a more valuable way to demonstrate local support is either to get other elected officials, and the Cortez City Council at that time, 2 years ago, was supportive of all these areas being designated. So getting other local elected officials is very helpful. And Senator Hickenlooper in particular has said that he cares a lot about that. And then the other is, other kind of persuasive opinion leaders in your community. So business leaders, we're always, very grateful to have Osprey to always be
I was thinking about
speak
that.
out and support it. But others, Alpaca Rafts and others that are over there in Montezuma County, any of those kind of business owners and business leaders, that can be really persuasive too. And that's something else Senator Hickenlooper has brought up, that he wants to see demonstrations of local support, and he hasn't defined that as being county commissioners. He just wants it, people who will persuade him from the local area, and
like that country horseman.
Yeah, exactly. That'd be a perfect one too. Backcountry horseman would be perfect. So any allies that we can find along those lines, I think would be great to weigh in with the senators.
But probably not the bike people if they can't. I just learned that bicycles are not allowed.
They're wheeled vehicles or mechanized vehicles, so they're not. But actually, they have endorsed the Colorado Wilderness Act. So a group called Outdoor Alliance, which is the kind of the coalition of recreation groups. So it includes International Mountain Bike Association and the Access Fund and American Whitewater and the Colorado Mountain Club, and a lot of the outdoor recreation organizations. They've officially supported the Colorado Wilderness Act and the Core Act both, and that's in part because the boundaries have been drawn carefully to make sure it doesn't conflict with any existing mountain bike use, for example, or other kinds of recreational uses that are established and would be disallowed.
Well, I
So a
know
lot
the
of these,
backcountry horsemen are really worried about losing the trails because the bikes are kind of taking over the horse trails.
oh
And
yeah,
so I think they might really support it
yep.
because it would keep some trails for the horses.
Yep, they frequently have been a good ally in a lot of places. That'd be a great one to reach out to.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else? Any other questions? Any places we left out that that you think we should be focused on and thinking about as potential future wilderness protections? The one other place kind of always on our back of our minds is the HD Mountains, and the HDs are very interesting ecologically. Kind of the lowest elevation foothills of the San Juans. They just are kind of complicated because so much of it is leased for oil and gas development that looks like a potential significant conflict to members of Congress. Although we've so far been able to stymie the actual real oil and gas development in the HDs, but that's another one though, I think always be, sort of on deck as a place we should pursue.
Great.
Mark, is there any local support for protecting the HDs, say from, I don't know, the communities that surround it, Bayfield?
Yeah, well, we haven't really organized there recently on that topic. Back when the EIS was first done in the mid 2000s, we had unanimous local government support. So Archuleta County, La Plata County, Bayfield, Ignacio, Durango, everybody was unanimously in favor of protecting the HDs. So it's, and many of our members own farms and ranches surrounding the HDs. So many of the adjacent landowners are very much in favor of protecting it, who also happen to be members of ours. So
Great.
I have another question too.
yeah.
The land swap, that's part of the roadless areas. Is that involved in any of this, or is it totally separate?
It's separate, but it's that's the wildlands land exchange I think Jennifer's mentioning, which is to trade away part of a roadless area over by Wolf Creek Pass, the South San Juans, to a rich Texan. But it kind of highlights, if the roadless area there, the South San Juan adjacent roadless area, was protected through legislation and was part of the wilderness, then this land swap wouldn't even be under discussion because it would be not allowed. So that's a good example of why we're always trying to get legislative protections, which are the most protective and the most enduring ways to protect places, and they're not subject to sort of the whims of administrative decisions by agencies who may be persuaded by other factors than what's best for the landscapes.
Is there a timeline on that, on what's the next step of, if everyone wrote their comments to the Forest Service, and then what happens now, and what else do we need to do?
Yeah, so in the wildlands land exchange, the Forest Service is deciding whether they want to cut out a few hundred acres of the roadless area to make it available for this land exchange. And once they issue that decision, if they decide to go forward, then they can make a final decision on the land exchange itself, probably maybe by the end of this year. And then we could object to that. It's called an objection if you complain to the Forest Service about their final decision. And then if we still don't like it, then we can litigate it.
So it really wouldn't do any good to like protest now because they're still in the decision phase until the end of the year.
Yeah, but again, that's another one where you can always contact your elected officials too. So the senators in particular, I think if you were to weigh in and say something doesn't smell right to us on this, and we hope you'll speak out against it. And I think Senator Bennett's office is I think very dubious about the land exchange, and they just, I think, are not very happy with how the process is unfolded. And so I think they would be receptive to hearing comments like that too.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Well, awesome. Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you for the great presentation and the discussion afterwards.
Yeah, appreciate everybody hanging in there and spending one of your last weeks of summer on Zoom. So
It's raining here.
so smoky out, you couldn't see anything anyway. There's no reason to go outside, right? So.
Well, thank you so much.
Right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mark.
Everybody.
Bye.
Good night.